Hi everyone. Welcome, welcome. It's great to see you all coming in. Oh, those are some bright lights. I'll take my glasses off. It's lovely to see you. I think we will get underway because most of you are here. And isn't it fantastic? I'm sure that people have said this today already. Isn't it fantastic to actually all be in a space together, to be able to talk? Oh, there are my notes. To be able to talk, to be able to share ideas, to be able to just share connections with people, and connection being one of the major themes of the conference. I think that that's really a great thing to think about. My name's Madeline Morris. I present the finance on ABC News Breakfast. So some of you may have seen me there, so thank you for watching if that's the case. Keep it ABC. So in this session, we're going to be examining the impacts of the pandemic on Australia's housing systems. Now, these changes have been profound, and some of them you know very well already. So house prices have soared, putting them out of reach for an increasing number of Australians. There have been big changes to where people want to live and the types of dwellings that they want to live in. It's become harder and much more expensive to rent in some places. And building has become harder too. Just getting the materials has become a challenge. All of this adds more pressure on our already vastly overstretched social and affordable housing systems too. But before we even begin to look at the economics of it, I'd just like to reflect on the fact that the pandemic has actually changed the role that our homes play in our lives. We have spent so much time at home over the past 2 years. They've become our workplace, our kids' school, our refuge. For some people, they started to feel a little bit like a prison, which is very understandable. I've been thinking a lot about homes this week because I've just come back from covering the floods in Brisbane, a really short deployment there, but a very, very powerful one. I've seen people sweeping out water from their floorboards, dumping fridges that got submerged, pulling out the precious negatives and photos that they'd hurriedly pushed into garbage bags to make sure that they were safe. Their sense of devastation at having their homes so desecrated was profound. And it wasn't just the cost and the work of cleaning up, it actually felt like their safe place had been taken away. So in my job, I talk a lot about the housing market. Prices, interest rates, where's hot, where's not hot. But being in Brisbane was a really great reminder for me that when we talk about all of that, what we're actually talking about is people's anchor. It's their safe place. It's the place where they marked their kids' heights against the door. It's where the stain on the carpet reminds them of that great dinner party. It's where they can look at a wall and lovingly remember all those arguments they had with their partner about what colour to paint it. Or perhaps that's just me in my case. Their home is the centre of all of the circles that then ripple out from that. Their home, their neighbourhood, their community, the butcher, the dentist, the library, and those circles go out and out. So when we talk about all of those numbers, that is actually what we're talking about. And many people in Australia don't have this safe and secure haven. Access to safe, affordable housing is the cornerstone of social and economic security. And that's why it's so important that we understand what's going on with housing in Australia. Because when we talk about how the pandemic has affected the housing sector, we're actually talking about how the pandemic has affected one of the most important pillars of people's lives. And you all work in this sector, and I know that you know that, but I just thought it was worth reflecting on before we start a session where we're going to have a whole heap of really important numbers thrown at us. So we are going to delve into all of this today with some of Australia's foremost thinkers in the housing space. So the session goes for an hour and a half. We will be taking plenty of Q&A, and you have the format in which to send that. I've got the little iPad ready to take your questions. So I'm going to introduce the panellists to you now. So Tim Lawless is the head of research at CoreLogic. He's one of Australia's leading property market analysts and commentators. He and his team provide analysis for government agencies, regulators, international domestic corporates ranging across the property, banking and finance sectors. I need to read all of these because these people are so actually accomplished and do so many things I can't memorise it all, so forgive me for reading these things. Angela Jackson is lead economist at Impact Economics and Policy. She's worked across tax, fiscal and social policy in government, where she's worked on major reforms in the health, education and disability sectors. She has authored major reports on housing policy, and last year was awarded her PhD in health economics, which is a pretty cool thing to achieve in the middle of a pandemic. David Rumbens is partner at Deloitte Access Economics, where he is a senior partner. Put your hand up, David, so people know who you are. Senior partner in the firm's macroeconomic practice. He has a special interest and expertise in analysing trends in residential housing construction, and he works for developers, peak bodies and government agencies. And Rod Fehring, put your hand up, Rod. Last one standing. He's the chair of the National Affordable Housing Alliance and the executive chairman of Fraser's Property Australia. He has nearly 40 years experience in the property sector in Australia, the UK and the USA, and he will be speaking today with both his developer's hat on and also telling us more about NAHA, the new alliance which is focused on fixing Australia's worsening housing crisis. So the session is going to go until 5:15. We'll finish bang on 5:15. So make sure to get your questions in nice and early so that we can come to them as soon as we can. Before we get into hearing from all of our wonderful speakers, I just wanted to introduce you to Meg. So Meg is a colleague of mine at the ABC, and she is one of the many people in Australia who's trying to achieve that so-called Australian dream of owning her own home. But she gives a really great perspective on exactly what the pandemic has done to achieving that dream. Here's Meg.
Hi, I'm Meg. I'm 31 years old and I'm looking to buy my first home in Melbourne at the moment with my partner. The process has been completely soul-destroying, to be honest. We're just completely exhausted. It started with the money. So we were looking to buy a 2-bedroom unit for around $500,000. That's what they were going for at the time. But as we started getting our deposit together, those same places started going for $550 and then $600, and now it's kind of $650 if we're lucky. I wanted to save $100,000 up front so I could have 20% as a deposit, but now that figure is a bit more like $145 with the new prices plus all the stamp duty that comes with it. I've been lucky. I mean, I've saved that much. We've got our pre-approval sorted, but now entering this whole world of actually putting offers on places is a whole new hell to navigate. We'll go to inspections and there's 50 people there. There's a line out the door of people clamoring for contracts, and the agent will tell you that you should really put in an offer tonight if you want to be competitive, and they tell you shouldn't put subject to finance on the offer because the vendor won't accept that, and you don't really need a building inspection. It feels like no one has my best interest at heart, and even making an offer, being in a position to do so, is becoming less feasible by the day. It shouldn't be that way. I mean, this is my life savings. It's the biggest decision that I'll ever make. And I feel like I'm being pressured to make it in a day. I feel like the people around me think it's nothing. I hope that I can get out of it soon, to be honest.
So that's Meg, and many of you will actually know people like Meg, I would think. Tim, sound familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. I can understand what she's going through, especially with her deposit is being ran away from by the speed of the property market.
Yeah, and so you're going to talk to us, to give us a bit of a big picture first of all about what is going on with affordability and housing prices in Australia since the pandemic.
That's right. So I'll try to set the scene for everybody today and look at where we've been through the pandemic. I think unless anybody's been living under a rock, they'll know that the housing market's been extremely strong through the pandemic. So to punctuate some of the points, shall I go through? Yep.
Absolutely. Yep. Let's do it.
I'll bring up a couple of slides just to punctuate some of these points. So I thought it'd be interesting just to start with maybe some high-level figures before I jump into some of these graphics. Housing in Australia, the overall asset value, is getting pretty close to being worth $10 trillion now. It's about $9.7 trillion as an overall asset class, right? So it's about 3 times the size of all the superannuation funds in the country, about 4 times the size of all the shares we trade on the ASX. So it's a massive asset class. You can understand why it's so important to policymakers and regulators, as well as everybody who's looking to buy a home like Meg, right? It's about 55% of household wealth in that asset class. Prior to COVID, so coming into sort of early 2020, the overall value of the asset class was around $7.5 trillion. So it gives you a bit of context on the importance of this asset class from a policy perspective. You can see the cycles we've been through across Australia's housing market in the graph behind me. That just looks at the rolling annual change in values nationally. So you'd probably describe this as a national or a macro view. You can see that housing values are the annual growth is just starting to turn now. Right. Remember, the annual measure is a really good measure of momentum. So we've already started to see the market slowing down. In fact, the rate of growth has been slowing since about April last year, and that's now showing up in the annual numbers. So maybe that's some good news, is that housing prices aren't rising anywhere near as quickly as what they were previously. But still, a 22% growth rate over the past 12 months is quite extraordinary. And the other thing that's really different about this cycle through the pandemic has been the really broad-based nature of it. Normally, through a housing cycle, you see a few cities or regions around the country that are counter-cyclical. Think about, say, Perth or Darwin through the previous growth cycles, which have been generally on a downwards trajectory. Or think about coming into the GFC, it was generally a market more around Brisbane that was showing a lot of growth, whereas Sydney was still quite soft. This cycle has been very synchronised and uniform. Pretty much everywhere around the country has seen extraordinary levels of growth, particularly the regional markets. Maybe a better way to look at this, though, rather than looking at percentages, is actually looking at dollars, right? This is probably more in tune with how everyday buyers or consumers think. It's probably more important when we're talking about affordability as well. So if the typical Australian homeowner, through the pandemic, so from the beginning of March 2020 through to the end of last month, they've seen about $144,000 added to the value of their home, right? So generally, housing is earned more than most Australians would have during that period. To Meg's point, the market's moved way faster than what incomes have.
That's extraordinary when you just make that point, that the value of the home has moved more than what most Australians, the average Australian, would have earned in that point, at that particular time period.
In some cases, it's more than double the pace of income growth. Think about it this way, wages are up about 3.5% last year, about 3% last year, actually about 2.3% last year.
2.3.
Sorry, I'll keep on going down.
Inflation's 3.5.
Thank you. And housing prices are up more than 22%. So it gives a bit of context there. So you can understand what Meg is saying from a graph like this, where just the typical value of a home nationally, not in Sydney. Sydney's gone up a lot more, even though in percentage terms it's a bit less. It's starting from an already extraordinarily high base. But to my point a bit earlier on, the market's slowing down. When we start looking at, say, a more granular reading on the market, a rolling 3-month change rather than a 12-month, you can see it really clearly that the market's becoming, it's not moving quite as fast as what it was. In fact, when we reported our numbers yesterday for February, Sydney recorded its first decline, its monthly decline. It was down 0.1%. So you can probably better describe that as levelling out rather than moving into a downturn. But that was the first downwards movement in Sydney in 17 months. But you can also see the markets showing a lot more diversity now as well. So you've got markets like Brisbane and Adelaide that are holding quite firmly at a very high rate of growth, whereas more expensive markets like Sydney and Melbourne have clearly slowed a lot more. And there's a whole bunch of factors around why. Affordability is only one of those factors. You've got other ones around, say, rising fixed mortgage rates, lower housing market sentiment. You've got some of the demographic shifts that are happening as well. I'll touch on those factors in just a moment, but we're definitely seeing a lot more diversity in the marketplace than what we were seeing earlier in the pandemic. And also the regional markets, of course, are showing a much more insulated trend at the moment. They're not showing as much signs of slowing down. Regional areas that have shown the strongest price growth tend to be those markets you could really loosely describe as, say, lifestyle-oriented markets. Your sea change or your tree change locations, areas that are commutable back into the major capital cities have typically seen the largest rate of growth as well. But chances are we will see regional markets also starting to slow down. There's probably a bit of a lag effect here that I think will gather some pace, because these markets are also being impacted by affordability. They're being impacted by a higher cost of debt. And of course, as more and more people return to their workplace, you'll probably start to see some of the, the shine of regional locations diminishing.
And on average, they've increased by 26%, haven't they, as opposed to the 22%?
Well, capital cities are up about 19% over the past 12 months, and regional markets up about 26%. So a huge gap. The last time we saw a gap this big, by the way, this broad, where the regional markets were outperforming, was back in that previous very strong growth phase, 2001 to 2003. And that's also when I think Bernard Salt might have coined the whole sea change phrase, if I can credit him with that. That was the last time we saw regional markets outperforming as strongly as what they are at the moment. And to my point a little bit earlier, this is what the trend in housing values looks like when you overlay it against wages growth. Housing, obviously a lot more volatile, a lot more cyclical than what wages are. You can see that in the graph on the right. But over time, even though there's been periods where housing values have fallen as well as risen, over time, just looking at that table on the right-hand side, you can see that even over the past 20 years, we've seen wages rising at around 3% per annum on average, housing values rising at about 5.5% per annum, just moving through some of that volatility and cyclicality of housing trends. So this isn't something new. Affordability challenges have been with Australia for a long time, but they've certainly been amplified over this most recent growth phase. It's also been a characteristic of the market that we've really seen a huge amount of demand coming back into the marketplace. So a really, basic way to explain the growth trajectory is we're seeing record levels of demand in Australian housing. And this is all domestic demand, by the way. We're seeing a very small component of foreign buying in the Australian housing market now. Obviously, foreign borders or overseas borders are closed as well. Not that stops foreign buying, that's probably more policy related. So we've got turnover tracking at about 6.1% across Australia. Absolutely record level of transactional activity, but at the same time, we've got listing numbers or advertised property, the number of homes available for sale are still about 30% below the previous 5-year average. And that really helps to explain this mismatch between supply levels, which are extraordinarily low in terms of advertised supply, and demand, which has really been unlocked through a whole bunch of things. Going back to that previous slide, if you look at I'll just touch on this really quickly. Go back to that period between 2015 and 2019, affordability actually improved quite nicely. Remember, Sydney prices fell about 15% during that period, and affordability was the silver lining of that downturn. Absolutely, that affordability improvement has now been completely eroded, and we are seeing the dwelling value to income ratio is at new record highs. It's well above 10 times in markets like Sydney, getting close to 9.5 times in Melbourne now. So where to from here? There's a lot of things happening that I think really highlight the markets moving through a transition or a pretty clear inflection point. All these factors or underlying fundamentals that were pushing housing prices higher have now lost their potency. You've got obviously interest rates are one factor. Rates aren't going up just yet, but fixed term mortgage rates have been rising since about April last year. So that's already started to impact on the marketplace. You've got that improvement in affordability has been completely eroded. So no longer is housing benefiting from better affordability, especially in regional markets where we've seen such strong growth as well. Housing sentiment has seen a real downturn. We generally look at, say, the Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Sentiment Survey, and they've got their time to buy a dwelling index, which really does reflect concerns around affordability, is down about 30% from its recent peak back in November 2020. Household savings, if you saw the GDP numbers today, that's come back down to about 14% or so, the saving ratio. That's still high, don't get me wrong, but it's well down from the peaks of the earlier lockdowns, where it's well above 20%. And then finally, you've got this mismatch in supply and demand is starting to be addressed. We're seeing more listings coming back in the market. In fact, here in Melbourne, we're now seeing total advertised supply is above average. In Sydney, it's nearly back to average levels. And unsurprisingly, they're the two markets which we've seen stabilising or moving towards the down phase most visibly as well.
It's so fascinating because if you go back to the start of the pandemic, do you remember that there were predictions of 30% house price drops? And we had 22% house price rises. What did we get wrong? Was it the government intervention? What was it? Was it the low interest rate environment?
Yeah, I think at the very beginning of the pandemic, everybody thought the sky was going to fall. They probably didn't take into account the response from government. The stimulus, both monetary and fiscal stimulus, is really what got the housing market going. And all that pent-up demand that we'd seen building up through, from the macro-prudential controls that were added to the marketplace and the Royal Commission, which saw credit availability tighten up and affordability impacting, all that was unlocked around the middle of 2019. And then COVID happened and all the policy really amplified demand after that.
All right, we'll get more into that in a little bit. Angela, you've been taking a look at rents, which obviously is such a crucial part of the overall housing sector as well. And it's similar trends, just up and up, generally speaking, as well, isn't it?
Well, not really, actually. So it's actually quite different to the housing market and to the housing affordability issue, because what we've seen, I think, with the rental market in particular is not one Australia, so it hasn't been uniform across the country. We haven't seen the same trends. We've seen in markets like Sydney and Melbourne, for example, rent's actually quite flat. It's actually been quite a good time to be a renter in many ways. You've had the eviction moratoriums through the pandemic, providing people greater security of tenure, which, for a lot of people, particularly those who've lost their jobs during the pandemic, was particularly important. And rents have been pretty flat during that period. But then if we look into regional Australia, we see a very different sort of picture emerge, and in those capital cities outside Sydney and Melbourne, where we're seeing rents going up double-digit increases in some cases. Now, this matters, of course, because for a lot of low-income people in this country, living in regional areas and those other capital cities has been one way that you can live and survive, particularly if you think about job seeker, for example, where it's impossible to rent a one-bedroom apartment in Sydney and Melbourne on the unemployment benefit. But if you're living in a regional city or a regional area in this country, it was possible to get by. But those increases mean, and if you look at, for example, you can look at very localised areas. It's a good thing about the data in this space. If you look at, say, Bathurst, and you look at the increase in price on a one-bedroom unit in Bathurst over the last 2 years, it's gone up around $40 in the bottom quintile. So that's the cheapest one-bedroom apartment on the market, a $40 increase.
For someone, what time period is that?
That's over the last 2 years.
But per week, per fortnight?
Per week. So that means if you're on job seeker, rent assistance, that's 10% of your income, an increase. Now, maybe that doesn't sound that much to you or I if we've got big incomes, but if you're living that close to the breadline, that is a lot of money, and that is a huge reduction in your a huge increase in your cost of living, and a huge reduction in your capacity to spend on food, on education, on health, all those other necessities because of that increasing in housing costs. So I think what we're seeing across Australia at the moment is a real difference between regional areas and capital cities. But watch out, and I think that's really the thing. As we look to the economic recovery, we're obviously going to see over the next 12 months migration return. During this period, one of the reasons rents have stayed low obviously in capital cities is, there haven't been the international students come in, there haven't been the migrants coming in, people who would normally fill some of those rental spots, so there hasn't been the competition. They are obviously going to come back, and that's a good thing on one level, but it will mean rents in those capital cities are also going to go up. That's in the context of other price rises. So already for low-income people facing higher costs of necessity, we talked about CPI before, the ABS does some nice sort of differentiation between essentials and non-essentials, and actually the non-discretionary are going up at 4.5%, and that impacts again low-income people more. And so for low-income renters over the next 12 months, we're likely to see those rent increases come through in Sydney and Melbourne, making things even tougher than they have been previously. And I think from an economist's point of view, what does that mean? Well, it means, you know, people's capacity to spend is going to go down because more is going to go in terms of housing costs. So that's going to impact broader consumption, and that's going to be an economic problem. But it also means, and as a health economist, one of the things that I worry about when we think about housing affordability is if people are spending so much on housing in this country and an increasing share of their income on housing, particularly people on lower incomes where it's simply impossible to rent and to live in major capital cities, that means less money on the productive things they could be spending on that we were talking about before, on their kids' education, on their own health, on their food, on the things that make them more productive members of society. And so it impacts our economic growth more broadly. And I think as a country, we really need to have a discussion about, we focus on house prices, rightly, and it's what we talk about at barbecues. We certainly don't talk about rents. But as a country, we really need to have, I think, a step back and go, what are we doing here? Because we are seeing wealth go through the roof. It is making us all richer if we own a home, and that might feel nice and that might feel good. But what is it doing to the fundamentals of our economy, and where are we actually investing as a country? And what it means is, as individuals, what we're investing in, rather than our productive capacity and the things that make us happier and healthier, we're investing in, in something that means that housing costs are going up and the proportion that we're spending is going up, and it's distorting a lot of other decisions that we're making. And I would argue, probably leading to lower living standards overall. And I think it's something we really need to be careful of, particularly over, we're going into another election cycle. Unfortunately, this time there aren't policies on the table that would take some of the heat out of those questions. But we really need to think carefully about how we are structuring this market in particular and what our objectives are, because at the moment the objectives are simply fueling higher costs, less affordability, and that is particularly as we recover, going to impact lower income families.
And we'll get to talking about social and affordable housing and that space in a minute with Rod, but you just talking about that, Angela, reminds me of, I did a segment on News Breakfast at the end of last year, and it's meant to be not lighthearted, but people, as you say, people love talking about house prices. It is what we talk about at barbecues. So there was an economist who had, she's a real estate economist, and she'd done something about, where is the next Byron Bay? And so I had a segment on saying, where is the next Byron Bay? And there are all of these beautiful towns that don't want to be called the next Byron Bay because they don't want to have a whole bunch of people coming into them, which I completely understand. But I actually got an email from a lady who lived in Byron Bay after that saying, you don't get what it's like to live here at the moment. There are women and children being turfed out of their homes because the affordability in the rental side has just gone completely out of whack, which is also to do with Airbnb and those sorts of things as well. And that's a factor too. I read an article about a guy who was kicked out of his rental property to make way for a yoga studio in Byron Bay. Yep. And none of the yogis going to do yoga at that yoga studio would have ever wanted that to happen to that bloke, but he was now living out of his car. And that is so those two sides just go so hand in hand, don't they? The rental side, the affordability side, and it is. You're right. We don't think enough about it, generally speaking, when we talk about the housing market in a conversational way. I think the other thing that we don't probably talk about a lot, unless you're doing it, is building. And the effects on the building sector have been absolutely profound in this pandemic, haven't they, David?
Yeah, look, they're really starting to come through, and not good news either. So, Madeline, you scheduled 3 economists in a row, so 3 lots of bad news in different dimensions. But Rod's going to come through with the good news at the end. But if we're thinking of the impacts of the pandemic on the housing sector, underlying a lot of what Tim and Andrew have been saying is, Tim pointed to the main driver, lower interest rates, increasing housing values, and we might be thinking, oh well, that's starting to come off now. We've seen interest rates starting to go up. The cash rate may go up later this year. Do we get some reprieve? Well, we may do in terms of housing values, in terms of the land component. But unfortunately, it's not getting easier for builders in actually building houses. So we've actually now got an environment where we've got inflationary pressure. I mean, it's something that the general business community hasn't had to deal with to this extent for quite some time. And so we're seeing within the building sector that's starting to have a significant impact as well. And what we do see within the building sector, or we have seen through previous cycles, is this part of the cycle where you start to have costs going up, so price of materials going up, wages going up. Many builders are operating with fixed revenues or fixed contracts, and they're suddenly being faced by a cost surge. It's the environment where we can get more insolvencies coming through, as we've seen just last week with ProBuild.
With ProBuild, which had its own specific issues. There were longer term issues there that just wasn't to do with the building componentry sector. But I did note the other day, I was reading some figures and they were saying that actually the building and construction area is the most heavily indebted sector in all of Australia at this point in time.
Yeah, look, which is going to create a risk for cash flow. So particularly in an environment where we've noted the CPI has moved up to 3.5%. It hasn't been there for a while. If we look at the housing component of the CPI, and the housing component here doesn't include land values, it's the construction component that reflects rents, construction, maintenance and utilities cost. But that's now above that as well. So it's moving up to 4%. We're seeing a lot of supply chain pressures. So
is it mostly down to the supply chain? Is that the issue?
Well, so far, but we're starting to see wage pressures as well. So supply chain, I mean, if you look at transport costs up 12% in the past year, obviously, big concern on many fronts over what's happening in the Ukraine, but from a business sense that may continue to increase energy prices and what that will do to transport and users of materials. So there are significant pressures as well as materials, but we're also starting to see some pressures in terms of wages as well, and reflective of the skill shortage. And this is not just in the construction sector. I mean, so Deloitte's polled CFOs across all sectors, and by far the number one issue on the mind of CFOs was how do we attract and retain our key workers? It's skill shortages has become the key issue, and it's partly it is a function of what we've seen through the pandemic of a build-up in demand. We've had lower interest rates, we've had government stimulus, and then we've had closed international borders, so that migration channel hasn't been there to allow workers to come in. We've got on the screen there a measure of job vacancies per unemployed person, which is at a significant high across all industries. It is in construction as well. We're seeing more shortages across key occupations within construction. And so all these things will build to wage pressure over time, which you would expect. But then thinking from the point of view of the developer or the end consumer, to some extent those costs are going to come through to the end consumer over time. So that's, I guess, a dimension of the problem, what might help on that front. So we have opened international borders, so that migration channel will start to help.
But just trickling at the moment. It's not like there's a big upswing.
Yeah, that's right. Look, that will help over time. I think it's also worth having a look at kind of the structure of the construction sector as well, and particularly the workforce. So just shown on the chart here, the female share of employment across all sectors and construction. And for those who perhaps can't read the labels, this is over a long period of time. This is from 1985 to 2022. And over that period of time, the female share of employment across all industries has moved from 38% to 48%. So we're seeing a steady shift up over time. Over the same period, 37 years, the female share of the construction workforce has moved from 13% all the way to 13%. So we haven't started on and this is a significant part, half the demographic that is really not getting a look in the construction workforce for, no doubt, a myriad of reasons.
And if you think about the sectors which have a broadly female employee base, which are retail, healthcare, personal care, childcare, they could be earning triple if they worked in the construction industry, but there are still these really large barriers to entry, many of which are cultural.
Many are cultural and perceptions, but there's a lot to do to break that down. Now, I mean, what can we do? Things like training, mentorships. I mean, if government wanted to invest in improving capability in the construction sector to broaden its base and drive down costs over time, it could do a lot worse than invest a lot more in training. Perhaps better directed than throwing money at the demand side. But we may get onto that later.
We're getting into this already, are we?
And look, I mean, one final point is this is also a sector which arguably is ripe for disruption by technology, and this may be something that both can reduce costs over time or increase quality of build, but it could also be something which helps perhaps break that perception for female workers in the industry as well, if it becomes a different kind of technology-led sector. So, whether that's 3D printing, robotics, greater use of design to manufacture rather than bespoke building, changing processes as well as adopting sort of greater digital technology over time, I think creates opportunities. Not necessarily going to solve the problem this year, though.
Okay. Please do get your questions in. So if you go to the Events Air app, then that's how you're able to get them in. I haven't received any yet at the moment, so I don't know, Sharon, if I'm doing it wrong, but I think I am doing it right, and I just haven't seen any from. Has anyone sent a question in yet, and I just haven't received it? Yeah. Okay. I might just see if I can have someone up here to help with that, because I'm not receiving them at the moment. So if someone can come and help me, that would be great. While that is taking place, Rod, we've had a lot of big, pretty bad news. You're going to bring it home with the good news, aren't you, on social and affordable housing?
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, the good news is I'm not an economist. There we go. I'll really pick the cue from Angie and what she was outlining, and I think the consequence of record rates of house price rises, which feed into record rates of displacement, if you like, because the negative gearers get the opportunity to be able to cash out on a total return arrangement, so you get a shrinking supply of rental accommodation, particularly in the regions where they've finally got a kick up, so they can basically cash that in and go and do something else with it, which unfortunately then shrinks the supply of affordable housing for private rental, which at the same time increases the competition for what affordable housing rental there is. And for those people holding that, of course, in the circumstances, they want the best covenant, they want a higher rent if they possibly can. Because generally speaking, negatively geared housing has been roughly around about a 4 to 4.5% yield long term, rough enough. That's shrunk to what, sub 3? Without some capital gain, it makes no sense. Mind you, interest rates are at below that, but when interest rates shift around, it makes no sense to negatively gear. But put that aside as a different argument. So all of that simply translates into increased vulnerability. What happens when? And when interest rates rise, driven by factors over which no one in this room or in Spring Street or in Canberra have control over, which is the rise of inflation driving the cost of capital internationally. Australia's a net borrower, so effectively interest rates have to rise in those circumstances. And when you go to Tim's slide, when he looks at the volatility of the housing market over an extended period of time, the nature of it is up and down. It doesn't sort of rise steeply and then gradually ease off, it plummets. And in the circumstances it plummets. Why? Because economic confidence is eroded immediately by virtue of rising interest rates, cost of capital flowing through all of the cost bases in the economy. So for those reasons, you get a bit of a perfect storm arising, and that one is largely around increased vulnerability, because when you have really from post GFC record low interest rates, and then what happened? Now we are in post COVID record low interest rates. The capacity of households to be able to borrow more has essentially been capitalised into house pricing, and as a consequence, the relative affordability has stayed relatively unaffordable in the scheme of things. It started unaffordable and has just got more unaffordable with a bit of a blip in between, as Tim pointed out. So in those circumstances, we have a set of circumstances where vulnerability will increase if and when interest rates rise. The question is how much vulnerability there will be, and how stressful that becomes at a particular point in time when you'll introduce more competition into the market via opening of borders. You'll also introduce reduced supply of product available. So the response to that is the key thing. And well, NAHA, where our focus is very much on trying to come up with some responses.
Yeah, do you want to go through and tell people about it? So who here has heard about NAHA? I know that there is a lot of interest in it. Yeah, lots of people. It's a really interesting and very diverse alliance of different groups who you wouldn't think are normal bedfellows, Rod?
No, and they sort of don't stay in bed all the time either. But we'll put that aside as well.
Well, do you want to talk us through it? Because I think that there is a lot of interest in it at this point in time. So just, yeah, talk us through.
Okay, I'll use some slides.
Hey, go for it.
I can't help myself, but before I talk about this one, because it does need a little bit of interpretation, NAHA, National Affordable Housing Alliance. First point to make is there is a difference between housing affordability and affordable housing. Housing affordability is about all the things that were talked about here: house price rises, interest rate policy, the role of the RBA, prudential controls, etc., shrinking the available or the terms and conditions on which banks can lend, increasing the the serviceability requirements on purchases, blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. All that stuff is about affordable housing, housing affordability, which are macro issues. I mean, they're big issues that go to major policy levers of the economy. And I apologise, I'm sounding a little bit like an economist.
You are. You're doing a very good impression of an economist.
I'll stop from here
So what
on.
is affordable housing then?
So affordable housing is the product that you actually provide support for. It's housing that is either for those people who are on below average incomes, even dependent entirely on government welfare payments, Centrelink, etc., in order to be able to fund their lives and the lives of their dependents, whether they be elderly women with disabled children or disabled parents, etc., etc. People who are in circumstances where I envy Meg, her ability to be able to save $145,000, but these people are not earning anywhere near $145,000 to have available to put on a deposit. You're talking about 3% wage growth on. You're getting indexation and what have you, but you're talking with people around about $40,000 to $45,000 per annum, and they've got to live on that with all of their dependents. So in those circumstances, you've got NAHA is aimed at trying to address the provision and the supply of social housing, which is housing which is owned either by the state or preferably, in my view, by community housing associations who need to be bulked up because there's too many of them, frankly. They need to be consolidated so they're bigger to be able to provide more across the board. That they manage people who can't ever expect to participate in the housing market and have barbecue chats about that.
But as that graph very well shows, the social housing as proportion of occupied housing is just going on a one-way trajectory in Australia.
What this graph, the top line is the total number of housing stock. It's a bit over 400,000 dwellings out of 10 million thereabouts.
Yep.
The dotted line, which is deteriorating, unfortunately, I was going to try and provide some good news, but I'm not here at the moment. unfortunately, Australia's population has grown, surprise, surprise, over that period of time since 1990 by about 3.1, 3.2 million thereabouts. And yet the proportion of households in Australia that are targeted at affordable or social housing has shrunk from a bit over 8% in the early 80s to less than 4% now.
So just to go back to the big theme of this session, which is the effect of the pandemic on the housing scene, is there a discernible effect on social and affordable housing?
Well, the pandemic has done, the first thing it did was confound the analysts who said it was going to, the sky was falling, and I'm responsible for a development company that services the residential market. We thought, and we actually went into negative sales, more cancellations than you actually make. But that only lasted 4 months, and it turned around. In those circumstances, all the things you've talked about, record low interest rates, stimulus poured on top of a market that was already recovering. So our treatment for a fire was actually to run out with a hose with petrol in it and put more into it. So that got it on alight. There was pent-up demand through stimulus. People weren't afraid of losing their job because of JobKeeper, all that sort of stuff. People weren't able to do much with their money other than sort of buy takeaway or renovate the house, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff happened. So from that point of view, you've got rising house prices, which were confounded. You've got increasing costs associated with that, with supply chain difficulties, which are compounding things. Your program, home builder, good idea, except it's probably at the wrong time, because if you can produce a block of land, we do that as well, in wearing a separate hat, it takes you around about 12 to 15 months because of the supply constraints in the trades to enable a block of land to be produced in the current market in Sydney or Melbourne. So, on top of that, you've still got to then be able to find a builder who'll build for a fixed price. They won't, because they can't.
So short answer is pandemic equals more need for more social and affordable housing.
The pandemic has pumped up and inflated the market, and as a consequence, the vulnerability the supply of social and affordable housing has shrunk. And as a consequence, the circumstances when the stimulus turns off and interest rates rise, the vulnerability increases significantly, and there has to be a supply response.
So talk us through what then this supply response, the innovative ideas that you've come up with.
I'll get to that in a minute, because I can't help a table, but this tries to give you a little bit of what happened.
I hope that people are
You won't be able to read it, so I'll tell you what it says.
Okay.
Firstly, you've got about 155,000 people on waiting lists. That's public housing waiting lists. You've got NIFIC that's just completed a review, which is setting around about a shortage of social and affordable housing required, about 800,000. 800,000 dwellings. Keep that in mind against a total market of 10 million dwellings. So about, surprise, surprise, about 8%, in addition to what's already being provided. You've got a situation, so that's about 45,000 dwellings per annum every year. Now the forecast for the next the next 3 years for 184,000 houses to be built. So therefore 25% of those houses need to be delivered in the form of social and affordable housing. How many is that likely to be? It'll be somewhere close to 0 or 1.
Wow, okay, when you put it in those terms, that's pretty stark.
So it is pretty stark, and as a consequence, you'll get a further shrinkage of the amount of social and affordable housing available in the market. In addition to that, you've got a set of circumstances where over the next 15 years, again, NIFIC review, 290 billion is going to be required to actually address that. Now, all these houses won't be built. Governments will go out and they'll rent properties, and so they can use that for social housing. They'll do all sorts of things to reduce the cost, given limited funds. But essentially what you've got is a situation where if you take all of the state government strategies, and I've read them all, sadly,
Who works in state government here? Who makes interesting reports for Rod to read?
No. More importantly, who was the one who actually got the template that everyone else copied? But apart from that, if you add up all of that over the committed statements in those strategies, you'll get about 16,700 dwellings committed by virtue of those various state housing strategies, worth about 1.3 to 1.4 billion per annum.
All right, I'm going to move you on because I do want to get to some
I know.
solutions, and because we've only got 45 minutes of the session left, and I want to get to some
The reason for
people's
talking about
questions.
all of that, though, is to say, to recognise that the states by themselves are only going to spend $8 billion of $290 billion. That's an interesting number. And in addition, if you throw in Commonwealth Rent Assistance and the National Homelessness and Housing Affordability Agreement, NHA, I don't think that's quite right, but there's another 1.6, so 7.1 billion. You put the two of those, that's what they spend per annum, subsidising rents for people to rent affordable housing. Put that together, you get just under 9 billion a year against a need for about 20 billion a year. Okay. So it's the answer then that NAHA's come up. I mean, we're a bunch of clever people, but you have to find another source of capital, obviously.
So,
and the private sector has to be that source of capital.
So I'll get you to just on dot points, and people can come and speak to you afterwards, and they can certainly go to the NAHA website if they'd like some further information as well. But you do have some, pretty clear ideas here. So
the first one is what's called, it's a really good name, the capital aggregator. All that is basically to say we take a tax credit that is provided by the federal government that is put through a competitive process where the tax credit is used to fund the gap between what's commercially viable in the provision of housing with a social and affordable housing component and what's not. The gap is somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 percentage points. And as a consequence of that, you use that tax credit to actually bridge that gap. Okay. You go into the market, you don't just have one project, which is what has constantly been done over the last 30 years. The government rolls out a demonstration project, it's a one-off, everyone says this is fantastic, we should do more of it. And then 3 years later, it's an echo, because, we should do more of that, what happened? So the point is that you basically create a competitive process where you're not just rolling one set of tax credits out, you're rolling out about $500 million worth of tax credits. That will bring with it, for every $1 of those tax credits, you'll bring about $4.80 in. And that way you get a multiplier factor by the private sector bidding for an incentive, the incentive driving the delivery of a social and affordable housing component, project by project, right across the board.
You've got a few other
I'll go to
four
the
pillars. I'll just quickly skip through them because I do want to get to the last one, which has been a big particular focus here in Victoria. The Future Fund.
Take 20 billion.
Yep.
Invest that somewhere else.
Yep.
A net return of a distribution of 3%. That represents the ability to be able to deliver about 1,500 dwellings per annum.
Yep. Activating affordable build-to-rent housing. Build-to-rent
is about an 18,000. It's an emergent sector where it's operated commercially. It's currently not treated like social infrastructure. It's not treated like any sort of infrastructure at the moment, and needs to be treated the same as other types of infrastructure. In those circumstances, there are currently about 18,000 dwellings being produced by that. It will grow to be a significant component of the market. Use the tax structure to enable a component of build to rent to incorporate social and affordable housing, and then we go to reprioritisation.
And then, the reprioritisation. So this is very interesting. So for those of you who are in Victoria, we'll explain what it is, and because the state government basically floated this idea and then very swiftly took it off the table 2 weeks later.
Well, they floated an idea that sounded like it.
Yeah, true.
So what was floated was the idea that all new housing, 1.5% of the cost of new housing be levied and put into a special fund and used to fund social and affordable housing. Okay, at a high level, all right, that's fine. 3 questions emerge. One is, why should only new housing actually be charged with a cost of solving a problem that established housing has created? Because the appreciation of property values is not just on new housing. If you look at the costs associated with its provision and you look with the cost as physically where it can be, all of the appreciation is effectively happening in the established housing market. The new housing market only adds about 1.5 to 2% to housing stock per annum. So why charge that sector only in the circumstances to pay for social and affordable housing? First point. Second point, I guess, in this is that it's applied to the total cost of the house land package. What we proposed here was not to do that, would only focus on that infrastructure component that actually delivers the ingredients of what an urban place is. the basic contributions that you provide for open space, water, sewage, drainage, all those sorts of things, the taxes and charges that you apply, state stamp duty, which is a hideous cost and has been attempted to be removed, land tax as well, a whole bunch of those taxes that add up, which represents somewhere around about between 25 and 30% of total costs associated with producing a product anywhere. In those circumstances, we said take 1% of that. So it turns out to about $1,500 a dwelling. Just take 1% of that and make it a priority. Don't make it a discretionary thing that's down the bottom. Make it a requirement at the top as an infrastructure contribution. Do that and you'll effectively generate about 50 million per annum, which can be channeled through an aggregator to effectively create a leverage on top of that, which gives you the ability to produce somewhere between I can't remember what the number was. I'll go backwards.
I think the total number that you're forecasting is between 11,000 to 15,000.
Add it all together and
per year.
And so is that the panacea? No, it's not. All it does, if you take that, say 14,000 as the average, add it to the 16,000 that states are doing, gets you to 30,000, and you're still 15,000 short.
This is from Anonymous, who's come in and said, quite simply, there is no affordable housing for our clients that are most at risk, so they remain homeless for extended period of time with little to no hope of getting a long-term housing outcome.
And sadly about that, the face of who's homeless is not a bloke with no teeth. It's a mum with two kids living in a car.
Yeah, and increasingly women above the age of 50 as well. So I just want to actually bring you the story of another lady who falls into that category. She is a renter. She lives in regional Australia. She's 70 years old, and I think that she really nicely explains the situation and just really brings home, and will bring home for a lot of us, what the reality is for many people in that particular area. So if we can listen to Kay.
My name is Kay Thistleton. I'm 70 years old. I live in a little area of the Bega Valley. I live in private rental in the country in a converted dairy. I have been asked to leave, but I don't have a leave by date, which I'm very glad about. So I have started to look, and the places where I'd like to live are very expensive now. They were not 2 years ago, but because of the bushfires and because of COVID, prices have gone through the roof. I was asked to leave because my landlords think I'm too old to look after the garden, basically. The challenges are the high cost of properties. I'm just on an aged pension. Finding somewhere in an area that would be suitable for me. I don't want to be driving too far these days. I have some medical conditions, so I'd like to stay around where my doctor is. I think the specific challenges have been the rising costs of rent. Living in the country has suddenly become very attractive for people in the cities who just want to get out of the cities. So we have COVID refugees, as we call them, and they're coming from the cities, usually having sold a property, so they've got enough money to pay big prices in rent. They're able to pay, say, 6 months in advance so they can secure a place. So local people are really being forced out of the market. We had a housing crisis before the bushfires. We've had a housing crisis for as long as I can remember. The way rents are going, I don't know. It might be that I look at moving in with a friend, sharing expenses that way. I truly don't know. It's scary. I just can't walk into an agency and say, find me a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom unit. I need it next week. It's impossible. It just really is impossible. So I truly don't know. In 10 years' time, I'll be 80. I don't particularly want to go into a nursing home at all, ever, but what are my options?
It's a really good question. And we've just had a question into that point. What about renters where the greatest level of stress and poverty exists? What can be done to address rental affordability and supply, and how do we get more social housing? I mean, you've given some answers for social housing. Ange, did you want to pick up on them?
Well, we prioritise it, don't we? I mean, I think ultimately what we have seen in the housing market in Australia over the last 20 years, which really, I think, you can look at the history of this and house prices, and, they've definitely gone up through the 90s, but really it was the decision to halve the rate of capital gains tax in this country. That was a policy decision by the Howard government that has led to an absolute fuel on the fire of housing prices in this country, and house prices have gone through the roof as a result. It was a choice to say, rather than relying on public housing, we will rely on the private market through rent assistance to provide housing to low-income people. And it is a choice, therefore, to see the stock of social housing drop from 7% to 4.2%, well below OECD averages, which still remains at around 7%. They are choices that we have made, and those choices have consequences, right? And they have consequences for women, we were talking about women with children, women fleeing domestic violence, who have nowhere to go. They have no choices. So they go to specialist homelessness services, they cannot be housed, and their choices are homelessness with young children, which is incredibly traumatic, obviously experience adding to the trauma they've already experienced, or their choice, which many and thousands of Australian women are making every year, is to return to a violent partner. They have to make those choices because we're making choices about where we spend money, and governments are making choices. And this week, the Victorian government made a choice, which was, rather than have a political fight and to fight for that $800 million, to back away because it was difficult. And it is difficult in this space. We've seen the Labor Party in the last 3 years make a choice again, where they went to the last election with a policy platform that would have really changed the game, right? It would have completely taken the heat and taken the distortions, which is what they are policy distortions, away, so that the property market and the housing market could actually function properly, more efficiently, and better serve us as a country. And again, they've made the choice to walk away from those reforms. So if we look at the choices that women have, and I've forgotten her name, sorry, in the video, but Kay has, it's other people making choices that lead her to that situation. And I think we really have to face up to those policy choices that we're making, because it has real implications for people. I mean, this is, it is the basic thing that and this is why the OECD says it's so important. Everybody has to afford housing, right? You have to put a roof over your head. This is not like it's not buying a Maserati. It's not, other sort of things within the market where we might say, let's just let it go. It matters how much that people can access affordable housing. It is a crucial part of what we need as humans to survive and to function in society. And so the fact that we have policy settings in this country that don't focus on affordability but focus on wealth accumulation, to me, that is the choice that needs to change.
Well, and I think and to your point there, we've seen successive budgets throughout the pandemic not focus on social and affordable housing, focus instead on things like home builder, which
That's at a federal level, though.
At a federal, I'm talking about at a federal level. So just on home builders, so I just checked the figures. So there have been 113,000 new builds approved for that, 25,000 renovations, and $2.1 billion in grants have been paid as of now. I wouldn't mind just getting a sweep of the room, actually, from you experts in here. So who thinks that a home builder was a good idea for a policy response during the pandemic? Oh, come on. Come on. Really? What about on the panel?
Look, I think you could say it came in an environment when the feelings around the housing sector were different. I mean, we kind of alluded to that earlier, that people thought everything was going to cave in. So there's, I think you can point to almost the excuse of the environment at the time. But I mean, for me, I would still think, I mean, this is taxpayer money that you're using for a overwhelmingly private benefit. Someone's extension, someone's garage, new house. There's always lots of options for taxpayer money. So,
which does benefit blokes, it has to be said, in the most part.
I just think though that where does the federal government go every time we have a calamity? GFC, where did we go? Housing market. That was going to replace the mining boom, which everyone worried that we were going to disappear off the face of the earth if the mining boom finished. Where did we go in the COVID? We went to the housing sector again. The problem is that we think about housing as an economic tool, a part of macroeconomic policy. Again, I'm sounding like a bloody economist, but the reality is...
You're the developer on the panel.
I know, but the reality is that's exactly what it is, because what other levers have we got to stimulate jobs and go through the supply chain and provide a broad-based stimulus?
I think Ange knows plenty about the levers that you and I have talked about extensively.
I'm not saying that's right, I'm just saying that's what it is, and has been.
Look, and it has, and it is, and I think, certainly, obviously rather than doing the home builder, they could have just built more social housing, and then they would have supported construction jobs and, same economic benefit, but some social. But yes, you can also invest in care sectors and get even a bigger return in terms of the economic output. So, but that aside, obviously we do, as you say, see housing, because it is a big employer and it is a big producer and it has an important economic impact, we see it through that lens of being, what's its impact on the macro economy. And I guess I say as a microeconomist, let's actually take a step back, because it has a really important impact on people's actual welfare and their actual productive capacity as households. And we've kind of lost in that macro, let's just drive growth. We've lost then what impact that actually has on households. And in doing that, we've undermined economic growth. So it's kind of, in essence, we've undermined what our actual objective was.
That's good.
To Rod's point though, we've got two options in Australia to leverage our economy. We dig stuff out of the ground, or we build houses, it seems. And they're the two options we have at the moment that, there's a lot more options than that, but they're the two that generally get utilised, partly because we know housing has a strong multiplier effect. Pretty big labour market, generally builds wealth for Australians, that drives consumption, I guess is how the cycle goes. And to home builders' credit, to some extent, I don't think it was well thought out, but it was massively oversubscribed. It did see the housing sector really start to ramp up massively, but now look what we have. We have a housing sector, a housing construction sector that's ran into supply chain bottlenecks that we've never seen before in Australia, partly because of COVID and logistics and stuff like that, but partly because the demand side we've created has been by design. Right, so I think while that might help the economy in the short term, look at the pull forward we're facing now. There's going to be 5 years down the track, probably a result of this pull forward of demand. We will see the housing construction sector slowing down after this bulge of construction moves through the system.
There's another aspect of Kay's story which I think relates back to the overall theme of the pandemic, and that's the shift of people to regional areas. That she was seeing that in rents going up in regional areas, and I mean in part this has been a policy objective to decentralise across all sorts of governments for many years without much success at all, and an unintended consequence perhaps of COVID management policies has been to shift people to regional areas.
Created in a wet market in Australia to actually achieve that policy.
Well, I mean, maybe it's something that we can run with, that we've actually now changed some of our work structures so that which allows more people to live in regional areas. Now, it's perhaps happened a bit too quickly in some areas, such that we are seeing prices and rents go up in regional areas at a faster pace. But if we can harness this trend ongoing, maybe that helps us to reduce or to improve the affordability problem over time by taking people out of the bigger urban centres. Okay,
so we've had a question in from someone who is anonymous saying, what key demand side measures would help long-run housing affordability? If migration returns to long-run averages, won't that further decreased wage growth as has been the previous experience?
My response to that, I guess, would be to say that treat the need within the community from a vulnerability point of view as a part of demand, not separate it as being something different.
Migration, David?
Look, migration, migration has been really important for economic growth. We are, in a lot of respects, many sectors are struggling without that flow of migration. There's more that we can do on training, but migration has been part of Australia's economic success story over time. We just need to be able to manage it in terms of infrastructure and congestion.
I just add, there's no evidence, and there's been a lot of studies done on this. They're not perfect, I admit. It's very difficult to get a causal, but there is, generally speaking, no impact in terms of migration on wages, and that's because migrants obviously lift overall demand, so they lift economic growth and demand for workers, and they also lift productivity across the economy. So that migration wages debate, and as we saw through the pandemic, no migrants for 2 years. We've seen net migration negative in Australia, 80,000 people last year, and pretty much no wages growth. So the issues with wages growth, which is a completely another plenary session, again, it's structural, and there needs to be some structural reform to our labour market. It's migration itself is not the cause of the problem.
Tim, just to get your thoughts then on demand side measures.
Yeah, so migration, we've just been through a massive housing boom with negative migration, right? So I made the point during my session, the intro, that demand has breached record levels with no impact or even a downside impact from migration. This has all been domestic demand. What happens with migration is it tends to drive rental markets, of course, and that's what we're expecting as we see borders opening up, particularly foreign students coming back, is we will see a lot more upwards pressure on rents, particularly around inner city apartment precincts, of course. Remember, Australia's migration composition is about 60% non-permanent. So that 40% of permanent migrants that were coming in pre-COVID, that was rental demand as well, and then progressively it would long-term flow into purchasing demand. So migration tends to have a much bigger impact on housing demand from a rental perspective, but medium to long-term on home purchasing demand. So I think when we look forward, we're in a position now where this construction boom we're moving through is all detached homes, well, mostly anyway. Building apartments and higher density styles of dwellings is either back to average levels or below average levels. We're probably in a situation where 2 or 3 years' time, we're going to be in desperate need of more density.
There's a question from Thomas who says inner city metro apartment rents have fallen significantly over the last 2 quarters. Is this a trend or a temporary effect of COVID that will correct? And you seem to be saying
that's absolutely temporary. It's already rebounding. So just look at Melbourne CBD, classic example, where we're here at the moment. Rents around Docklands, South Bank, Melbourne CBD fell by 20 to 25% through the worst of COVID. The last quarter alone, they're up about 6% just in 3 months. Not because of migrants returning, but because a lot more domestic renters are looking towards the medium to high density sector because it's so affordable. I'm really interested in this question. Sally B says, given the volume of houses that will require remediation as a result of the floods, the recent collapse of ProBuild and supply chain issues with building materials, which are still an ongoing issue because of COVID, how should government policy respond? And I've been thinking about this a lot as a result of going to Brisbane, actually, because I was in reporting from some low-lying areas of Brisbane, so not on the river, but suburbs which are still low-lying, where the water just absolutely swept through. They used to be swamps. 100 years ago, they were swamps. And now, of course, because they're inner city, they've got beautiful houses in them, which are now, for the most part, destroyed. I spoke to one guy there and he said, look, honestly, I reckon long-term, we're just not going to be able to live here. So those issues, so there's that issue. There is the volume of houses that are going to require remediation. Further questions about whether we should continue to, whether we need to look long-term, and this is not a COVID question, but also a climate change question about where we actually put our houses. How should government policy respond? Now, this is a very big question, but I did want to ask it because I think it is really important. So if I could ask each of you to just give a really short thought on that.
Well, it just places further stress on the capacity of the sector that 5 days ago we didn't think we would need, but there's a rebuilding task that's, I mean, some of it will be government, some of it will be private. Angela's word before about prioritisation, it's to what extent will the rebuild be a priority? I think there's going to be an interesting longer-term aspect of what this does to ability to insure properties and insurance costs over time. So, there may be a sting in the tail across the country in terms of insurance costs to help pay for it.
My take is a little bit different, and I don't disagree, that's for sure, but this was supposed to be a 1 in 100 year event, yet the last time Brisbane flooded was 11 years ago. We know global warming's happening, climate change is happening. Perhaps these events are going to start happening more frequently. It's probably are. So to David's point on insurance, almost guaranteed, insurance in a low-lying or a riverside area in Brisbane is going to go up substantially. That's almost a given. A lot of people, I think, will be second-guessing their willingness or their desire to live in, living close to the river is a premium market. You're definitely looking for a premium property value in those markets.
But it wasn't just, this is the thing, it wasn't just people who live by the river who were affected. It was because the water table was so high from La Nina that when this just came through, people who are far away from the river were being affected.
Absolutely. Rockley is a good example.
Yeah,
somewhere in Brisbane. It's relatively affordable but quite well strategically positioned. But regardless, if it's a premium market or affordable one, you'd have to think with this sort of event happening in quick succession or 11 years apart, there is going to be people probably second thinking, should I be basing myself in a location that's flooded significantly within the space of 11 years?
I guess I'd say, I think the reference to, I think the last 30 years have been a good illustration of what short-termism produces. I think a long-term view would be a breath of fresh air in Australia that actually starts to, instead of reacting to a flood, start to think about the occurrence of a whole bunch of issues, whether they be fire, floods or other things going on in a country like Australia. Take a long-term view about spatial planning, regional development, housing planning. Wouldn't it be a good idea to have a national housing plan or even a population policy, something like that? That way you might be able to get ahead of these issues rather than saying we couldn't have foreseen it. I mean, if I hear that one more time, anyway.
Yeah, look, and I'd agree. I think on the issue around climate change, we've had so much debate in this country, unfortunately, around, action on climate change, and, we haven't done that, and we can have an economic debate about how much we've lost as a country as a result of those political decisions as well. But we clearly need to think about mitigation. We clearly need to think about whether it's bushfires and floods. The climate is changing, and it is going to change irreversibly, whatever we do over the next sort of 20 or 30 years. And we need to really understand that and plan for that, because, this situation with the floods in northern New South Wales and Brisbane, this is going to be regular. Bushfires are going to be regular. That is going to change the way we live and where we live. And we need national leadership, and I agree with the National Housing Plan. I think there's also a short-term impact, which is it adds to the economic uncertainty over the next 12 months. So we already have high inflation. This is going to add to aggregate demand more. It's good for the local Brisbane economy in essence, but it probably puts more price pressures into the economy and means the Reserve Bank is going to be even a tougher spot in terms of having to lift rates, because we're going to see inflation that none of us have seen in our lifetime, well, certainly my lifetime probably, or maybe early on when I was a little nipper, but certainly not in my professional life. And we are in for, I think, what is going to be a pretty heady, 12 months to 2 years in terms of monetary policy, I think, for the Australian population, as we see that inflation figure go up and how the Reserve Bank's going to have to respond. So it's going to add pressure to them. Lots
of people coming in saying, we really need a bipartisan national housing plan. How do we act and get a national strategy developed? The Federation of Governments needs to work, and this hasn't happened for decades, until this is a fixed, serious policy shift. Until this is fixed, serious policy shifts are constrained. And just to go back to the theme of the pandemic, I think that one thing that it did prove is actually that federal and state governments can work together. Not always completely harmoniously. They can. They can. I think up to possibly the last 6 months where the wheels slightly fell off and it did get a bit more politicised. But generally speaking, National Cabinet did broadly achieve, in terms of health outcomes, a good result. And more often than not, it was a unanimous decision. But it's interesting because it takes an emergency to do that rather than the longer term emergency, which is the housing issue. It's like the frog being boiled slowly in the water. It's the same with the climate change issue. It's the frog being boiled slowly in the water. They just can't seem to get together on these things.
It goes back to what Angie was saying about the consequences of the attitude that we pervade. The consequences of not supplying adequate levels of social and affordable housing are someone else's responsibility, not ours. And I think until the community broadly, government specifically, but the community that elects governments takes some or puts some sort of value on that responsibility being held to account, then I think we're going to keep swimming.
Yeah, keep in mind we're heading to a federal election now, right? It's the perfect opportunity for both of the major political parties to be having a platform on home ownership. Almost guaranteed there will be, considering housing affordability and the recent housing boom and so forth. I think both parties will have some sort of policy, but they generally tend to be demand-side policies. Maybe an expansion to the deposit guarantee or boosting the first home buyers grant or something like that, rather than long-term fixes and strategy around improving supply.
But they're demand-side because they're popular.
Absolutely.
Not because they fundamentally work, but because they're popular.
Yeah.
And it comes down to who votes as well, right? Because people and who they're going to vote for, because the people who are living in rental properties, they are not the swinging middle that parties are necessarily going for. That's an assumption, but I think that,
That's been said to me.
Has it been said
Renters
to you?
don't vote for the coalition, homeowners do. You're talking about basically the margins of 2% to 3% on a two-party preferred basis.
So that's part of the issue. And lots of questions for the panel, which I think is a really good place to finish up, actually, because we've only got 5 minutes left, about changing a mentality in Australia about not seeing housing affordability, not seeing housing rather as an asset class. And people celebrating when house prices go up, as they have done in the last 2 years, but thinking more long term and thinking about a broader pool of people, and particularly thinking about renters. Is that ever going to change in Australia?
When have we done it as a community? Only in necessity, in circumstances where necessity drives it. So do we need to have a crisis to drive it?
It's not a crisis?
No, we've got one.
We've got a crisis. Okay, thank you.
I was going to say, I think to Rod's point a bit earlier on, if we need this to change, it's got to come from policy. At the moment, we have a housing market that's almost 100% reliant, or a rental market, I should say, almost 100% reliant on the private sector to introduce rental stock into the market. We talk about changing rental incentives, maybe changing capital gains taxes or negative gearing. But what are you going to do when investors stop buying into the marketplace? It means the government needs to step up and introduce more rental stock into the market, as well as more community housing into the marketplace. I don't see any sign of the government actually taking on that responsibility.
Partly it's the sort of the timing of our perspectives on this. So investment in social housing can be an intervention which reduces the need for other social services and payments over time. And so it can stack up on its merits even in terms of its return to government. But generally that's on a time frame that's longer than a 3-year election cycle or a 4-year budget cycle. So if we can start to look at this from a 10 to 20 year cycle, we might come up with different solutions.
Yeah, look, it's always hard to change the political narrative and the culture, and I think, the reality in Australia is a lot of people have got really wealthy from housing in the last 20 years, like really, really wealthy, and we've seen, wealth inequality absolutely skyrocket as a result. And so how do you change that narrative? Well, it's about probably changing what you talk about how you talk about, how this is really damaging the economy. I think we often always see high house prices, that's a sign the economy is going really well. We need to change the narrative around what it means to get the economy really moving well and sustainably. Like, what does sustainable economic growth look like? And again, I'll point to the OECD. It doesn't look like rocketing house prices. It doesn't look like worsening affordability. It looks like, having affordable housing where households can actually put a roof over their head, invest in their health and education. That is what sustainable economic growth looks like. It doesn't look like what we have in this country at the moment. And changing that narrative is down to economists, changing about how we talk about these things, where we often talk about rising house prices as that's a sign of a healthy economy. We probably need to stop doing that and saying this is actually not a sign, this is not what we want to necessarily see, that this is leading to greater wealth inequality, that does undermine long-term economic growth. We know that. Every study shows it. Why not start talking about it more realistically? So I'm not going to say it's just our fault, because it's not. It's honestly, it's political leadership.
It's media. It's a whole narrative.
We feed the beast, right?
Yeah.
We feed the beast.
Yeah.
Which
and
is,
look, I can tell you, no stories get clicks like stories about house prices. People love talking about it. Everyone loves thinking about it. Just to return finally to that theme, because we do have just 3 minutes left, 2 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you for 20 seconds each. Big lessons of the pandemic that we can take forward. One big lesson on housing.
Monetary policy and fiscal policy works on housing.
Knit together federal, state and local government to a common purpose around creating and supporting housing for all, not just for a few.
David?
Stimulus certainly works, but maybe we should take a deep breath and think a little bit more about where it's directed before firing it.
We've got a federal budget in a couple of weeks' time, so we shall see.
I think for me the biggest thing was around the policies around people who were sleeping rough at the start of the pandemic, and how we often hear that it's intractable, but once it became a community-wide problem, suddenly we could house people, and that actually a lot of these problems, and that's more broadly, are solvable. It's just about will, and so I think we often sit back, this is so hard, it's too difficult, when actually, when the crunch comes, we can solve those problems.
I knew we'd find some good positive news at some point in this session, and so there you go. So there it is. We can work together. We do have the capacity, and that is one thing that the pandemic has taught us, is that, we can work together in so many different ways of our society to actually be a community and be not just a bunch of people who live next door to each other with picket fences in between. It's been such a great session. Thank you all so much, Angela, David, Rod and Tim. Thank you to you for all of your questions. Once we finally got it working, that was great to be able to get all of your questions in, and have a really great conference and enjoy all being together and being able to discuss these really important ideas together. Thanks so much, everyone.